Where is the evidence? Atheists ask for evidence for the existence of God, and they declare no evidence is to be found. And by this they mean any claims regarding God or any attempts to validate the existence of God, it must be made within their particular framework. We call this the MEST framework, matter, energy, space, and time framework, the naturalist reality worldview. Needless to say, this is a contradiction, because God, as the creator, cannot be found in the MEST universe. And so to inquire even about who created God is a contradiction of terms, and is a total invalidation of who God is as the creator. And so atheists have played this gambit in which they have effectively precluded any evidence for God. And this is interesting, because this play is that actually demonstrates the invalidation of their own position. So let's look at the atheist claim for a second. The atheist claim there's a material reality, matter, energy, space, and time, and it can be discovered through empirical means, through using empirical science to measure the physical effects that engaging with physical reality produces. So we can measure the charge of electric particles and strength of gravity and the speed of a mass accelerating and so on and so forth, all kind of little physical measures. But first, while we're on this subject, let's just look at this. What is a measurement? What is speed? What is weight? What is even mass? These are measures. Measures have no objective quantification value. These are all arbitrary designations created by man. When we see something fall, it's falling in a direction that we label, at a speed that we label, in a way that we define through our measuring apparatus. And even the observation itself is done through second-hand means. We look at machines or in our mind, but this isn't direct observation. We call it objective reality because it isn't within the mind itself. It's in a machine. It is an impact that the event has on a machine or the measuring apparatus. And these apparatus are basically created to measure these arbitrary units that we've created. If the units couldn't measure the phenomenon, would be no way to compare weights and measures and speeds and strength and velocities and so on. So we need that metric, that indexing. But of course, we're left with asking, where is mind, or where is this reality? Because everything ultimately is in the mind, but the mind is supposedly in reality. Reality is physical, but the mind isn't physical. The mind is composed of information, but reality is supposed to be composed of objective quantities or that can be measured, but the measurement only takes place within the mind using fabricated units of measure. The very validation of objective reality requires measurements that, while empirically quantified, remain contingent. They're not absolute truths. We can see the sun come up, but we can't prove the sun must come up. The truth that an electron has a particular weight is only contingent upon the measurements we make. We can't prove that this is the absolute weight of an electron, and we can't prove anything is an absolute truth through empirical means. We can't even prove that empiricism is a reliable source of truth or the necessary avenue to truth. All empirical evidence, all empirical verification is always contingent. Empirical evidence or experiments increases the probabilities, but it doesn't eliminate all possibilities. So seeing the sun comes up increases the probability that the sun will come up, but it doesn't eliminate the possibility that it won't, or that it'll just go careering off into space or whatever. No possibility is ever eliminated by empirical validation methods or the scientific methodology. So the claim that God doesn't exist because of empirical science is based on a hope or a belief. The empiricism can't remove the possibility that God exists, and the verification is always contingent. We can't prove that the empirical method will supply truth or will prove what's going to happen. And so we rely on the faith that this will be a reliable predictor of future events. The truth of science then relies on the assumption that matter, energy, space, and time is all that exists. And it's only by assuming that matter, energy, space, and time is all that exists that permits us to assume that the validation techniques of empirical science produce valid results. Because if we thought that the supernatural exists, then the results of empirical science wouldn't necessarily be valid, because science, by only testing and validating experiments based on the assumption that reality is physical, precludes any investigation into any other possibility. And the supernatural is only supernatural because of the assumptions of empirical science. So empirical science is really based on an analytical truth, an analytical faith that the circular reasoning behind empirical science is a valid assumption. But any circular reasoning is ultimately analytical. It's not experimental. It's not synthetic. You can't validate empirical methods by reference to the real world, when referencing to the real world is how you're validating the methods of the validation. That is, we can't disprove that matter, energy, space, and time is the only existence if we do this by using experiments that test for matter, energy, space, and time, and indeed assume matter, energy, space, and time is all that exists. It's a circular reasoning. You assume the reality and you test for the reality using methods that assume that that reality exists. So it's assuming a coherence exists based on the elimination of any other possibility. So if the synthetic truths of empirical science require the analytical truths of non-physical investigations on non-physical truths, non-synthetic truths, then the synthetic truths are invalidated by their dependence on the analytical foundation they rely on. Because if we're going to validate synthetic truths through the use of analytical truths, basically circular reason, then we've invalidated the synthetic truths. So in conclusion, if synthetic truths rely on analytical truth, then analytical truth is the only truth that really matters. And if we are only going to have analytical truths, the coherence of our ideas, then God must exist, because God is part of that coherence, because analytical truths rely on concepts, and a concept has to have an originator to be communicated, to have meaning. Meaning has to have an originator. And so analytical truths are based on information, and information comes from an intelligent or sentient being. And since truth existed before humans, there has to be an originating intelligence that came before humans, and de facto that's God. So the atheists claim that God cannot fit into the synthetic worldview they have is evidence that God exists, because their worldview cannot exist without the analytical, without the information that existed before their synthetic conception could come about, because our synthetic truths rely on the analytical truths that contain the information and the ideas. Because what is reality but a concept? What is matter but a concept? What are the weights and the measures and the indexing and the units of measure by which we define reality, but conceptual categories. So all of this is information. It's all based on concepts, and all of this had to come before the synthetic worldview. Otherwise, the synthetic worldview couldn't exist, and which means a synthetic worldview is derived from and actually corruption of the analytical. Synthetic worldview necessitates the analytical, and the analytical framework, the analytical worldview, necessitates God. And there isn't any way around this. It's a logical necessity. It's logically coherent because it is part of the analytical worldview. In short, what we're saying, if you want to believe in the synthetic reality of atheism, you have to believe and accept there is analytical truth. And if you are going to accept that, which you must, then you must accept God has to exist. To have an analytical worldview, you need the creator, the originator of the concepts. So, atheism, synthetic worldview, absolutely and categorically proves the existence of God is absolutely necessitated. It's inarguable. It's the most certain and absolute fact within our whole conceptual framework. And when you deny the existence of God, you're denying the possibility of analytical truth. And if you deny the possibility of analytical truth, your synthetic worldview collapses also. So you're left with nothing. So it's believe in God or have no reality whatsoever. So let's just run through this one more time. The atheist worldview is based on synthetic truths. Synthetic truths always reference the real world. The synthetic truth is true because it corresponds to what is physical. But not all truths can be related to physical. There's a lot of concepts are non-physical. They're not physically based. Empirical truths founded on this kind of correspondence with reality is limited because not everything can be confirmed through the empirical method. And so we have things such as mind, truth, love, compassion, and so on that are non-contingent truths, verifiable through the empirical method. And the empirical method itself is predicated on nothing existing but matter, energy, space, and time. But this is an analytical truth because it's based on the coherence of the idea that experiments can find the truth, experiments conform ideas to the real world, and the real world is composed of matter, energy, space, and time, confirmed by the science that is based on the assumption that matter, energy, space, and time is all that exists. So this circular reasoning is, by definition, an analytical worldview. But the analytical worldview is not dependent on the synthetic, and the synthetic can't confirm the analytical worldview. So this is why we say if you want to believe in the synthetic worldview, you have to believe in the analytical worldview. The analytical worldview assumes that reality is concepts. When we talk about reality, we're talking about the concept of reality, And when we're talking about matter, we're talking about the concept. There isn't anything real beyond the concept. It's the concept that is real, and it's the coherence of our concepts, the coherence of our thinking, that determines the truth or the validity of our ideas. And empiricism simply helps to establish the coherency of what we believe or how we are communicating and thinking. And if we assume reality is coherent, then the logic of reality is what makes it real. It's the logic of our thinking that determines the truthfulness. But the only way that the concepts can be coherent and have meaning is if they're truth. And truth, if there isn't any physical reality as such, if there's an objective reality, there has to be an originator of the truth, there has to be an originator of the concept, because what we're saying is that all there is the concepts that we use. The reality is just a coherent concept, a concept that fits in with the schemata of our thinking. But if this is true, then God had to speak the world into existence. The world, the universe, is composed of ideas, of concepts, and they had to originate in a sentient being. We couldn't have created these concepts. But if we didn't create the concepts, then there has to be a physical reality, a reality independent of us. But this cannot be so, because it doesn't fit in a logical way. It's always internally inconsistent, because we can't prove reality. It's always going to be contingent, and it's always going to be open-ended, and it's always going to be dependent on the existence of a conceptual worldview. So the analytical reality depends on coherency, and the synthetic worldview is not coherent with the analytical, but the synthetic is dependent on analytical truths. So it's basically just a choice between what is coherent, the analytical view, what is incoherent, what is inconsistent, the synthetic worldview, and that's the choice. And since there is only one choice, with the analytical worldview, and the analytical worldview predetermines that God must exist, is predicated on the existence of God, the inconsistency of the synthetic worldview determines God has to exist.